I start, right? Yeah. A pleasant good evening. We would like to begin with a brief word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for this opportunity for us to gather here this evening in this hallowed sanctuary. We ask that you guide us, give us the wisdom, the knowledge, understanding, give us the ability to articulate what we have to say here this evening, and may all that we do be in the blessings of your name. We ask these in your name. Amen. Good evening, District 5, North Hill. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Premier, Dr. Ellis Webster, the Honorable Member for District 5 and Deputy Speaker and Ministerial Assistant in the Ministry of Social Development, Mr. Merrick Richardson, retired High Court Judge, Justice Don Mitchell, members of the audience, especially those from the village of North Hill, our listeners via Radio Anguilla, and the viewers on gov.ai in Anguilla and Lloyd's Live. It really is a blessing to see so many persons beginning to turn out this evening, and I think that bodes well for our future sessions as we move around. I begin, as I always begin our sessions, with the opening stanza of our national song. God bless Anguilla, nurture and keep her, noble and beauteous she stands amidst the sea. O land of the happy, a haven we'll make thee, our lives and love we give unto thee. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, the fourth in the series of town hall meetings that the Ministry of Home Affairs is organizing to solicit the views of the general public on constitutional reform. I would like to state, as I've stated so many times before, that in the APM 2020 elections campaign manifesto policy, by way of a vision statement, we stated inter alia that the Anguilla Progressive Movement, APM, understands that enhancing the foundation of a great society means investing more in its people and empowering them to take ownership of their own destiny. Charting our own destiny means that we have the right to self-determination as the United Nations Charter mandates, and consequently, as a people, we will have to reach a consensus on a roadmap on how this can be achieved. Tonight, we have the pleasure of being in District 5, Road North, broadcasting from the Zion Methodist Church in North Hill. Sincere thanks must go out to the Superintendent Minister, Reverend Vincent Celestine, for allowing us the privilege and use of this hallowed sanctuary. In terms of focus, one area that I would like to comment on this evening is that of Anguilla status, or Belanger status as it used to be called. One aspect of Anguilla status, automatic citizenship, arising from place of birth, was raised by one of the attendees at the town hall meeting in District 7, West End. I would like to highlight another aspect. Ladies and gentlemen, I have made no secret of my intent as Minister of Immigration and Labor to have approved by Executive Council a pro-population policy focusing on attracting, in particular, persons from CARICOM nations to increase our population from our current level of about 13,000 people to some 25,000 persons within the next 10 years. How is this related to constitutional reform, you may ask? The draft constitution, which is posted on the Government of Anguilla's website, in Part 9, provides for a person to be granted Anguilla status on the basis that that person has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 15 years. And you can see Part 9, Section 106, subsection E, part 2, page 55. And I invite you, when you get some time, to go and look at that section. So the question before us here this evening is 15 years too long, given the proposed objective to, in effect, double our population within the next 10 years? Additionally, many of our Caribbean brothers and sisters who have lived here in Anguilla for an extended period often maintain that they feel stateless. Consequently, shouldn't we be thinking of reducing the requirement for Anguilla status to 12 years? I put that out there for your consideration, and I invite comment from the general public, those of you who are here this evening, and those of you who are listening via social media. Overall, I do sincerely hope that you have been finding these town hall meetings informative and enlightening. While attendance in person has been small, there has been extensive viewership on the online platforms, Facebook, YouTube, etc. We continue to be somewhat hampered by the health restrictions occasioned by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in terms of persons being able to physically congregate and attend these sessions. And so we are really pleased to see the numbers, increased numbers that are present here this evening. I am pleased that my ministry has been able to once again team up with the Department of Information Technology, DITES, and Mr. Gilbert Fleming of Titanium Sounds and in Anguilla to provide what we must agree is excellent audio, visual, and streaming for this meeting and the other meetings to come. I also want to acknowledge the invaluable assistance being provided by my able and capable Permanent Secretary, Dr. Aidan Harrigan, and other technical staff at the Ministry of Home Affairs in ensuring that the town hall meetings take place smoothly. Before I go to Dr. Harrigan to begin his presentation, I think it is only fitting to invite our Premier, Dr. Ellis Webster, and our District 5 representative, Mr. Merrick Richardson, to say a few words. Premier.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in District 5 and North Hill. You know, I always find this village to be one that is very welcoming. And given their love for the sea, you know, it's like coming from Island Harbor, except that, you know, Island Harbor, we always win the sailboat races. So in terms of the constitutional reform, I appreciate that, you know, Ministry of Home Affairs, you, the Minister, and the Permanent Secretary, Dr. Harrigan, have taken it upon yourselves to come out to each district and have these consultations. And even though the attendance has physically has not been great, we do know that we have the COVID restrictions, and now as they have been somewhat improved, we would expect more persons to show up as we go along. But I certainly think that the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, it is important that we as citizens of Anguilla, you know, come out, participate, so that we can construct a document that governs us, that we can live with. And it's very important in that regard. And certainly I want to see, you know, and hear from persons what they feel is essential going forward of Anguilla status, as you said, not only living in Anguilla, but Anguilla's status as a nation. And so again, thank you for this opportunity, and you know, thanks for welcoming me here.
Thank you, Premier. Honorable Merrick Richardson.
Thank you. Good evening. I'll take this moment to welcome you, Mr. Hodge, Dr. Harrigan, to North Hill District 5.
No stranger.
No stranger, of course. No stranger, of course, to our constitutional reform. I'd just like to say to the Premier that we're in 2021. I can't recall the last year the UFO won a race or even entered a race. But we're here to talk constitutional reform and not vote race. These meetings are very important. There's a lot of talk on the airwaves and social media about what our Constitution should look like, what it should entail. And being the highest law in the land, it's important what is happening here with the constitutional reform in taking it just not to a central location, but actually in the villages themselves. So persons who might feel a little timid in coming out to a central location have access, and they can, it's right at their doorstep, in their backyard, and they can take part in these meetings. And it's also on social media where persons, even a diaspora, can still follow and still give their views on what our Constitution should look like. So I'm looking forward to being informed and learning something this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Merrick Richardson. I now take pleasure in inviting our Permanent Secretary, Home Affairs, Dr. Aidan Harrigan, to present on Anguilla's constitutional evolution and the key changes under consideration for this round of constitutional reform. Following his presentation, the floor on our online platform will be open to accept your questions and comments. Dr. Harrigan.
Thank you, Minister. Good evening to one and all, and thank you to the Honorable Merrick Richardson for welcoming us here. We don't get a chance. Okay, is that better? Yes, so again, good evening, and thank you to Honorable Merrick Richardson for welcoming us to beautiful North Hill, and also to acknowledge the presence of Honorable Premier and also Justice Mitchell and those who have come out to be with us here this evening in person. We appreciate it very much. Right. So, for some of you who, hopefully there are some people who have been tuning in every session. Repetition is good. That's how we learn. But with each, so a lot of it is the same, but with each presentation we do tend to add some more. So, stay tuned. Okay. By way of context, there's an international legal mandate by way of the United Nations Charter, and this says, all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely determine their economic, social, and cultural development. Okay, the United Nations in 1946, by way of UN Resolution 661, established a list of non-self-governing territories. Then, as you know, countries across the world, like ranging from India, started becoming independent. The United Nations, by way of Resolution 1541, Roman numerals X5, 15 of 1960, identified that self-determination is attained through three modes: independence, free association, and integration. The United Nations in 1961 then established what is called a Special Committee on Decolonization, also known as the Committee of 24. And as per the mandate, the United Kingdom government and other governments that have administrative responsibility for territories, they are supposed to report on an annual basis on progress with their non-self-governing territories attaining self-determination. And to that end, the United Nations declared the first International Decade on Decolonization from 1991 to 2000, and the hope was that all of the non-self-governing territories would have qualified for removal from the list by the end of that period. that notwithstanding, we've gone through several decades. We're now in the current decade, 2021 to 2030, and there's still a number of non-self-governing territories remaining, including Anguilla. So there are 17 in all. How can country become be deemed to have attained self-determination? According to UN, this could be through independence, so we're familiar with that concept. For example, Jamaica would have become independent from Britain in 1962, and it has its own government and it's not ruled by any other state or country. Free association is defined as the result of a free and voluntary choice by the peoples of the territory concerned, expressed through informed and democratic processes, and should permit the right to determine the internal constitution without outside interference. An example of that in our region is Puerto Rico and its relationship with the United States of America. The other mode is integration, and this is defined as it should be on the basis of complete equality between the people of the former territory and the country into which it is being integrated. And examples in our region are Martinique and Guadeloupe and their relationship with France. Okay, a quick whip through to Anguilla's status over the years. Anguilla was established as a British colony in 1650 and administered first through Antigua, and then in 1825, administration was switched to St. Kitts. In the 1960s, as part of the decolonization movement, early 1960s, the UK formed the West Indies Federation with the idea being that all the Caribbean territories would become independent through that mechanism. However, that, as we know, that did not work, and Jamaica decided to leave, and then Trinidad with Eric Williams famously said, 1 from 10 leaves none, 0. And so that was the end of that. And so that ushered in different states, and one of those states was the associated arrangements, Associated State of St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla in 1967, which had was to have a semi-independence status, meaning that the locally elected government would have responsibility for internal self-government, with external defense and foreign affairs the purview of the United Kingdom. However, Anguillians, after suffering years and years, centuries of what they deemed to be neglect, they were not happy with this relationship, and they voted, well, they, through various means, expressed their displeasure, one of which was the statehood queen show that was disrupted, stones thrown, and so on, and that things escalated to the point where the Kittitian police who were stationed in Anguilla, they were kicked out of Anguilla, and so now we have what is known as Anguilla Day. We celebrate to this day, May 30th, from May 30th, 1967. Subsequent to that, a referendum was held, I think it was maybe on the park, actually, by show of hands, I think, July 11, 1967, and Anguilla formally seceded. A constitution, which was drafted by Roger Fisher, a Harvard law professor, was adopted. A second referendum was held on February 6, 1969, and following that, Jack Holcomb Constitution was taken on board. There were a number of visits of various British officials, and if you've read the books by Mr. Calvert-Petty, Mr. Nat Hodge, you get all the flavor there. There was one gentleman who came And apparently, Mr. Webster and the local officials, they had, once he came to the airport, they had certain things arranged for him. And he just apparently threw some pamphlets in the air, and they departed. And Mr. Webster and they felt that it's as if he was throwing, foul to counter the foul, and they felt, very annoyed by that. And so they asked him politely to leave. And it wasn't too long after that the United Kingdom sent down some paratroopers and along with some members of the Metropolitan Police Force. And then formal rule from Britain was passed by way of the Anguilla Act 1971 and has maintained in some form or the other since then. Another key moment was 1976. 1976 Constitution that provided for ministerial government, and you had parties developed in contested elections. Then there was the Anguilla Act of 1980, which empowered Her Majesty to allow Anguilla to separate from the tri-state, and a date appointed, and this was December 19, 1980, and we celebrate that holiday. We celebrate our holiday to this day, Separation Day, and that also paved the way for St. Kitts later on to become independent. And in fact, I think just in the last week, they celebrated, I think, 38 years of independence. The Constitution currently in effect is the Constitutional Order of 1982, as amended in 1990 and as further amended in 2019. As I said earlier, Anguilla is still classified by the UN as a non-self-governing territory. Attempts at constitutional reform. So in the early 2000s, in fact, in March 1999, under the Labour government, the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office published a new policy paper on how they would treat with their territories, and this was called the Partnership for Progress and Prosperity. And one of the outcomes of that was to rename what was called at that time dependent territories, renamed as overseas territories. And the UK government also, in this policy outlook, encouraged all the territories to form constitutional review commissions or committees, and then to make proposals to the UK for constitutional change. However, the UK government was quite clear to indicate that for those territories who wish to become independent, they could do so once it was the clear and express wish of the people. However, it ruled out integration or free association with the UK. Okay, attempts at constitutional reform. There was one in 2001. However, no recommendations were made. Although there were speeches, the speeches and transcripts of meetings were subsequently published. And at this juncture, I'd like to welcome Mr. David Carty, who would have been involved and that, in fact, led that attempt. In 2003, the United Nations, for the first time, organized a decolonization seminar in a non-self-governing territory, and it was held in Anguilla. And the United Nations Secretary General, he made some remarks that were, well, he was not here in person, but he provided some remarks where he stated that achieving self-government for the peoples of the world has been one of the cardinal goals of the United Nations since its inception. In 2006, another constitutional committee was formed and held extensive consultations and concluded its work within 6 months. However, no recommendations were adopted by the government of the day. And then they had to wait until 2015 before another attempt was made, and the Constitutional Committee, over a period of 2 years, worked and then tabled a report and a draft constitution. Okay, again, some context. The Anguilla Constitution, going back to 1982 and so on, 1980, could be said to be a constitutional dictatorship because it provided very draconian powers for the UK government. For example, the UK government could, by Adam Council, suspend the Anguilla Constitution and rule by direct fiat rule. And that could still be done today if it's so desired. It's not a theory because in the TCI, I think in the 1980s and then again in 2008, thereabouts, that trigger was actually pulled. In any event, based on the consultations from the 2017 round, the public made two main demands, according to the report by the committee, Constitutional Committee. One, they wanted to see improvement in democracy in terms of the governing framework and frameworks and laws. And two, they wanted to see an improvement in the standards in public life. And so that informed, those two questions, those two impulses informed what was drafted by way of the Constitution, draft Constitution of 2017. So what does the Constitution, draft Constitution look like? There's a preamble, and it's, I've pulled out some elements there which you can quickly go through. It says, for example, whereas the people of the territory of Anguilla have over centuries evolved with distinct cultural identity and will, which is the essence of an Anguillian. Further, acknowledging that the society of Anguilla is based on certain moral, spiritual, and democratic values, including the belief in God, the inherent dignity of the human person, the inalienable right of the freedom of the individual, and respect for fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law. And affirming that the people of Anguilla generally have expressed a desire to become a self-governing people and to exercise the highest degree of control over the affairs of the country at this stage of its development. So, some statements of principle there, some statements of intent and belief. Okay. So other elements, as the minister would have highlighted in his speech, the question of Anguilla status, and part 9 of the Constitution, the draft Constitution, which is posted online. There's a clean version and there's a tracked version to show all the changes that arose from the discussions that were held, negotiations that were held in Anguilla in November 2019 between a wide-ranging group and the UK officials. So it provides for Anguillian status to be granted by the Anguilla Status Commission on the basis that a person, and picking out some, part 2, has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 15 years and is married to an Anguillian and has been married for at least 5 years. So as the minister said, and based on other aspirations of the government, and although a constitution tends to last for a while, so that's only one consideration. But the whole goal of increasing the population of Anguilla, to have sustainable population in terms of taxation and so on, economic development growth. So that's one aspect. Should that 15 years be reduced to something less, to perhaps 12 years. And then you have different elements that also come into play, like permanent residency and naturalization, so there would be a knock-on effect, a ripple effect. But also, we get a lot of representation for people who've been living here, and particularly people from other CARICOM countries, who in some cases, yeah, they've lived here, annually they have taken out work permits, but yet it's as if they're a bit a limbo, no man's land, so to speak. For example, you find that they would like to perhaps buy property in Anguilla, but because they're not Anguillan, they don't have Anguillan rights status. That means they have to get an alien land license. And there are cases where people try to go around that and end up in dubious partnerships with people who then end up taking advantage of them, because what they do is a form of fronting. And so this question of, as Minister Hart said, they consider themselves to be stateless, and again, and whether we ought not to do something about that. So, as the Minister said, we would like to hear very much what people think about that. Another avenue to Anguilla status is through marriage. And if you're been married to an Anguilla belanger for 5 years, you can then apply to the Anguilla Status Commission. However, what the Anguilla Status Commission actually is concerned and actually wish that through the Constitution, maybe adding more to the language, to the Act, because what they've seen emerging is what is called marriages of convenience. And so the question is whether there should be some protections there to mitigate against that. So some food for thought there, and definitely interested in hearing your views in those areas. Right. Representation, and this is, in terms of the feedback, this is where people have tended to be most vocal. House of Assembly, currently in the Constitution there's provision for elected members to be not less than 11. However, there's a proposal that it be increased to 13. There's also the proposition that the Anguilla should form a single electoral district, and that no less than 4 members should be returned to the Assembly by way of island-wide elections. So this is currently in effect, and that there should be no less than 9 individual district members. That's a proposal. And so currently there are 7 districts, electoral districts. We have the smaller ones, like District 7, West End, and District 2, Sand Hill. Then we have the large ones, like District number 4 and 5, districts number 4 and 5, with over 1,000, 3 and 4, sorry, yeah. And then district number 6 is also, Road South is also a big district. So there is the question of whether either to keep the 7 electoral districts but have a more equal distribution across them, and so that would mean some redrawing of boundaries, or whether, as I said, you should increase the number of districts to 9. There's also been the suggestion that, and it seems to be a popular suggestion in gaining popularity, that the whole of all the representatives in the House of Assembly should be elected on the basis of Anguilla as a single electoral district. In terms of if there are any changes to the boundaries, this has to be done by way of law, and would have to be informed by District Boundaries Commission, so that there can be, the whole process could not be called into disrepute. There's also the question of the ex officio members, who the Attorney General and the Deputy Governor, and the desire and the wish is that they should not have a vote. That's would be provided for in Section 57.3. And this issue came to the fore in July when we had the passage of the GST bill, and both members voted as they can do under the current constitution. But the question is, in issues such as that, and generally shouldn't that be policy and so on, laws shouldn't that be left to the elected officials who, if there's dissatisfaction by the general public with what they've done, they can recall them in 5 years at the next cycle. So why the proposal to have increased representation? And the main reason is to, as they say, to prevent the Executive Council from becoming a rubber stamp, in that Executive Council decides on policy and the laws to be passed, and then if by convention when you go to the House, the government side stands together, the way things are, it means that the government side would always carry the day. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Improving standards in public life. Key proposal is to have provision for regulation of campaign finance. You know, that always comes up. They say there's need to protect against undue influence by individuals or groups or businesses. And so the view is that all individuals and parties vying for office should compete on a even playing field. And where you can do this is through campaign finance legislation, and this is common in many Commonwealth countries and some Caribbean countries. Institutions and individuals for protecting good governance. This is in Part 9. And the viewpoint is that there needs to be certain guardrails for the conduct of public life and public business. And so examples of this are Public Service Commission, Public Police Service Commission, and so on. There's the Anguilla Status Commission. And that in terms of new commissions, there's a view that there needs to be an appointment commission, for example, because then that would prevent, legislators from self-dealing or whatever you wanted. I mean, I don't know if folks had a chance to listen to Lawyer Astafan, who was on the radio yesterday, talking about the legislators' pension act from 2004, which is quite generous in provisions. Well, primarily is that there's the legislators don't have to contribute to the pension that they receive. Also, in terms of salaries, there's always been a lot of criticism that in Anguilla our politicians or elected officials are overly remunerated. So the one way to settle the issue above reproach is to have an independent body examining such issues and making recommendations. There's also recommendation to have Integrity Commission, Freedom of Information Commissioner, very important if you want to have good governance, and transparency is necessary. And you can only critique and hold any government to account if you have access to information. And then also commissions of inquiry where, if things really go south, then at the highest level to the lowest level, officials, including Premier or the Prime Minister, they can be held to account. Also, in terms of improving standards of public life, there's now a recommendation for a substantial section on public finance. The current constitution is very, very brief in terms of public finance, limited to things like appointment of the chief auditor. Most of what is included is actually seems to have been taken from a draft Anguilla order 2015, which the UK government was considering enacting by order in council in Anguilla. And reading further, what's in that seems to be modeled from provisions in the TCI 2011 Constitution. Of note, so it seeks to enshrine things like value for money, transparency, accountability, and so on. Of note, in there is Section 119, which would seek to repeal the current Fiscal Responsibility Act. So that means that there would have to be negotiations between the UK government and the UK government and sorry, we have some competition from some dogs. UK government and Anguilla government on the fiscal framework. And perhaps the most well-known area in the fiscal framework is the borrowing guidelines. It sets maximum debt that government of Anguilla can take out, and that's linked to 80% of recurrent revenue. Debt service, which should be a maximum of 10% of recurrent revenue, and then that government of Anguilla should put aside what they call a rainy day fund, have 90 days worth of recurrent expenditure in hand. Interestingly, in Section 129, there's provision for some exercise of functions by the governor as relates to the provisions in Chapter 10. And this does not appear in the TCI Constitution. However, the UK side, in their notes, have noted that these powers are implicit if you look at different sections of the Constitution. So all they're doing is making it explicit. I think it would be left to the AG chambers and the drafters to really decide if that is not a further erosion of the locally devolved powers. So that's something to flag. Moving on to Part 3, power of the UK governor. In the key areas, there has been no reduction of the powers of the UK governor. The UK has been quite clear about this. They've said that they are signatory to many international treaties and conventions, and therefore they have to ensure that they are, and Anguilla as well, and they have to be ensure that there's compliance. Also for the maintenance of good governance, and then to manage UK contingent liabilities. And all that means really is that if government of Anguilla were to go bankrupt, the UK government is legally obligated to assist. And so that means financial assistance, and that means using British taxpayers' money. And so the UK government tries to preempt getting to such a situation. So it's worth to know that the statehood constitutions, they had, as I said earlier, they had more provisions for self-governance, self-government than is currently the case. All of those associated states eventually went independent, so St. Lucia, Grenada, and so on. The only territory now, I think, that has a really advanced internal self-government constitution is probably Bermuda. At the time, the intention was that for them to go independent too, but they never did. The executive, Part 4, states that the executive authority of Anguilla should be vested in Her Majesty. Part 4 provides for the body to be named from Executive Council to Cabinet. Further, that it should be chaired by Her Majesty's appointed governor, and then should consist of the Premier. So the Constitution says, but the proposal is that should have not more than 5 other ministers, and then they have the two ex officio members, the AG and the DG, who would not vote. Part 1, protection of fundamental rights and freedoms. That's quite an extensive chapter, and that again that relates to the UK's international obligations. And one of the areas that tends to get a lot of airplay and so on is the protection of the right to marry, Section 16. The government favors language for marriage as being between persons of the opposite sex, while the UK is insistent on no such limitation, as, in their view, to do so would put Anguilla at odds with the European Convention on Human Rights, to which Anguilla is also a signatory. And that convention does not allow for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The UK has provided some compromise language which would basically, leave definitions, those kinds of things, hard and fast to Marriage Act. Independence. So in the negotiations that were held in November 2019, the question was raised, shouldn't the Constitution have a clause that provides a framework for triggering the process of independence? The UK responded that in their view, the Anguilla Act of 1980, and that's referenced in this Constitution, provides that Anguillians can opt for independence at any point, and it would be granted once it's the express wish of the majority, either through a referendum or a political party running on a platform which has as an explicit plank independence. As I would have mentioned earlier, the 1982 Constitution is one that holds, apart from amendments in 1990 and then in May 2019. In May 2019, there were 3 amendments. One was to broaden give greater allowance to granting Anguilla status. So therefore now, persons who are great-grandchildren of a person born in Anguilla and who has Belanga status can be, Anguilla status can now be granted Anguilla status as well. And there was a change from Chief Minister to Premier, and then there was also the provision for 4 members of the House of Assembly to be elected on an island-wide basis, and it also did away with the nominated members. So to conclude, 3 fundamental questions can be asked of the general public. Do the proposed changes satisfy the demand for increased democracy in the architecture and the framework in terms of the Constitution? Do the proposed changes satisfy the demand for improved standards in life, in public life? And are there any other principles of note or provisions which you, the general public, would want reflected in the Constitution? And then on the last page, there are emails there, and we have been getting some persons emailing to provide comments. Of course, folks, as these via YouTube or Facebook, they've also been leaving comments and questions in the chat, so we will compile those and seek to address as well, and to present a summary of those. So, Ms. Arch, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Yes. Just want to thank Dr. Harrigan. Each and every week he really reminds us of what went before, but he also brings new information to the table. The floor is now open for your questions, comments. We recognize Pastor Garrett Hodge.
In relation to the preamble, if you could bring it back up, please.
Preamble. Yeah. The mic.
If we look at the preamble, we notice that in the second paragraph, it says acknowledging that the society of Anguilla is based on certain moral, spiritual, and democratic values, including the belief in God, the inherent dignity of the human person, the inalienable right of the freedom of the individual, and respect of the fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law. You notice that it states, including a belief in God. And if that is to stay in our Constitution, then it is important that we look at the definition of marriage as God states through the Word, His Bible, which is and has been between, I don't even like the term opposite sex, because right now we have 5, 10, 15, 20 different genders. A marriage is between a man and a woman. It's to be. And I know that there are many people who say you are entitled to your religious viewpoint. You can stick to your religious viewpoint, teach it to your congregation, but your congregation does not have the right to impose that upon anybody else. Then, if that is the case, the other, for lack of a better term, the secular humanists don't have a right to enforce their belief on me either. We look at our moral and spiritual democratic values. If our Constitution is to preserve those democratic, moral, and spiritual values, then we are in a fight. I know that the United Nations, as mentioned from the head table, they have their idea that there are certain human rights that are universal, which includes the right of people to marry who they want, whether a male marry male or female marry female. But if our Constitution is to preserve our moral, spiritual, and democratic values, then we have to really look at this thing and break it down. Do I want my grandchildren, as they go to school, under a legalized same-sex marriage values in Anguilla? While, yes, each person is free to do what they want in their own home, their own office, their car on a beach or whatever, a private beach or whatever, that's their right. I also have a right to want my children and grandchildren to grow up in a society that respects our moral, spiritual, and democratic values, including our belief in God. So, if this is going to stay in our Constitution, then we have got to really define marriage as between a man and a woman. Or else we may as well take God out of it. Let us have a secular humanist constitution, but we can't have it both ways. Right now, and especially Europe and the States, the legislators are not legislating same-sex marriage. The court is doing it. They're going before a judge, And if you happen to get a judge of one persuasion, he rules in that direction. If you happen to get another judge of a religious persuasion, he rules in that thing. But legislators today are not really legislating same-sex marriage. They are running away from it and staying away from it. And we're going to put the onus on our legislators to legislate what is marriage. Now, in one other aspect, Mr. Harrigan, I can't remember what you said, but you spoke about the Marriage Act. Marriage is to be defined in the Marriage Act. I don't remember what, it was 16 or one of the other chapters. So if the Marriage Act is going to define what is marriage, then that will be up to the legislators. And the legislators, again, are going to come back to what does the Constitution say. Right now, we're not looking for compromising language. A person has a right, as we mentioned here, the freedom of the individual and respect to their fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law. So here is where we get the whole thing muddled. What was it? The act, you mentioned the Marriage Act?
Right, no, so...
No, just the chapter.
Yeah, chapter, part, it's part...
Part 16, clause 16.
yeah, in part 1, is it?
Yeah.
And then clause 16 and
yeah.
17. So
Yeah.
there are the definitions, and then they are linked to protection from, so there's a protection for a right to marry, that's in 16, and then the protection from discrimination. So
Right.
they link them. So maybe I can,
It's in part 1.
yeah. So maybe I can read. So the Anguilla side is proposing the definition as follows. Every man and woman of marriageable age, as determined by under any law, so see where that comes in, has the right to marry a person of the opposite sex and to found a family. The UK was proposing the following. Every man and woman of marriageable age, as determined by or under law, has a right to marry and to found a family in accordance with laws as enacted by the legislature. So the UK one, the UK language takes out marriage in terms of opposite sex. Then they're proposing by way of compromise, because apparently there was a lot of back and forth. They're proposing that the following language, notwithstanding anything in section 17, that's the section that deals with discrimination. Every man and woman of marriageable age, as determined by under any law, has the right to marry and to found a family in accordance with the laws enacted by the legislature. So, yeah, so it's basically leaving it up then to what the Marriage Act would define as being marriage.
But then we have an overriding obligation from the United Nations Charter on anti-discrimination and so on.
Yes,
Good.
provisions of that, yeah.
So I understand and I see where they're trying to appease us. But what I'm saying is that marriage is what marriage is and what marriage was. And we don't have the right to change the definition of marriage, although we have a right to live the way we in whatever union we want. But marriage is something that has been there, and we don't have the right, nobody has the right to change it because they didn't invent it, they didn't design it, they didn't write it out in the laws relating to marriage from way back from Adam. So today we don't have the right to change that. And although a person has the right to, in the privacy of their home, to conduct themselves in the way they want to, we have got to try and fight to preserve traditional marriage. I understand and I know that right now, even in Anguilla, if we were to take a referendum on same-sex marriage, the church side would probably lose. Because my understanding and my research is that even the young people coming up, especially of high school age, a lot of them are leaning towards, I'm not saying in their behavior, but I'm saying in relation to the law. I'm not saying in their behavior, in relation to the law. Mm-hmm. So we do have a lot of people in civil society advocating for normalization of same-sex marriage in our Constitution. And this is where we're going to have strong disagreements with that. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who are saying, that's why I didn't come here to push my religious view down anybody's throat. So I don't want nobody to push their secular humanist view down my throat, at the throat of my children or grandchildren either. A lot of people say, okay, you have a right in your congregation to preach what you want, teach what you want to your congregation, and keep it in your congregation. This is a constitution, a national constitution. And I have a right to try to preserve our moral, spiritual, and democratic values. I have that right, and that's what I'm advocating for, and I'm fighting for. Although we understand that there's a lot of opposition to it, but it's my obligation to take a stand and to register my stand and have it recorded. Whatever the end product is, we all know what our desire is, and the way marriage has been and how it worked, and what is really happening to the family today. And still we want Anguilla to be a law-abiding society. We want it to be a harmonious, loving society, but yet we are going against some of the fundamental foundations of our society. And yet we expect in the end to have all the benefits still. It doesn't work that way. Today, we can, apart from the Bible, there is evidence that Sodom and Gomorrah existed. There's archaeological evidence that those two twin cities existed and they were destroyed by fire. So if you want to look at the Bible, if you don't want to recognize the Bible, there's archaeological evidence that those two cities did exist and they were destroyed by fire. And we can find out why and where the fire came from. Thank you.
Do we have any more contributions from the floor? And Pastor Garrett, by the way, the points you made are captured and stored online, that persons, you can go back and see what you would have said. And so it's a record there. Yes, it's a record. Any other contributions? Mr. Carter, I see you looking at the mic.
Mr. Minister, Permanent Secretary, I am not being prescriptive on anything. To quote the mighty Sparrow in one of his famous calypsos about the P&M and steel beam, we know, we like it so. Constitutional reform in Anguilla is not a sexy issue, never will be. And my advice to the government would be, get on with it. If you have a draft, do what you're doing right now, and when you finish the rounds, pass it through the House. But I say that not from a position of negativity. I say that from a position of disappointment and regret. And let me explain. Quoting again from your preamble, the people of Anguilla have over centuries evolved with distinct cultural identity and will which is the essence of Anguilla, of an Anguillian. Mr. Minister, it speaks to cultural identity. I have always argued, and will never stop, although, quite frankly, I didn't even want to be here. I'm done with this. That constitutional reform is more than a legalistic exercise. It is a cultural analysis. Pastor Gary is referencing a particular aspect of cultural reality. But it is far more than that. And if you based what we're trying to do on history, because you reference centuries, therefore it is a historic analysis. It is not something that just popped up recently. Let me try and show you where I'm coming from. The history of our region has been a history, I hate to say this, of copy and massa. When the independence, self-determination leaders of iconic image in the Caribbean arose in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s and 60s, Sir Alexander Bustamante, Norman Manley, Eric Williams, you know the rest, and argued for self-determination and independence, right? And got it. They immediately and quickly and swiftly, without hesitation, adopted a form of governance copied from the metropole. The Westminster system, lock, stock, and barrel. The jury is still out whether that has served us well. Certainly we in the Caribbean have been fortunate in the fact that the change of governments in the Caribbean, by and large, has always been a democratic one, which is a good, very good thing for our record. But the expression of people's views, because you are asking, one of the key questions you are asking in this constitutional reform exercise is the essence of our democracy. How can we improve our democracy? When I was a first nominated member and parliamentary secretary in the House of Assembly, I either shook my head in wonderment or bemusement when time after time I would hear at that point in time when we did not have a leader of the opposition, but we had an opposition, that the role of the opposition is to oppose. That is a direct quote from a Victorian prime minister called Benjamin Disraeli, who was the prime architect of the rapid expansion of the British Empire at the turn of the 19th century. And Benjamin Disraeli argued that the role of the government, of the opposition, is to oppose. And I said to myself, hold on a minute. 7,000 of us, 8,000 of us, and your only role is to oppose what the 7 of us plus 2 nominated members plus an ex officio member and an attorney general sitting around a half-dead plywood table in the courthouse deciding issues on Anguilla. Is that your role? But it was. Because the father of the nation, just like Sir Alexander Bustamante, just like Eric Williams, adopted the system of centralized power going into an executive. The most unconstitutional event in the Caribbean, unconstitutional event, was the Anguilla Revolution. It succeeded when perhaps it should never have succeeded. It succeeded in the teeth of the fact that had it failed, a lot of our leaders, not just Mr. Webster, might have been dangling on the end of a rope on the charge of treason or sedition. But we pulled it off. And in the constitutional reform that I headed, which was a total failure and I will tell you why. I was inspired by that event to try and craft a debate, a discussion, an analysis of the cultural identity of us Anguillians and see if out of that discussion could come a better form of governance. And a better form of governance that stayed away from a copy of the Westminster system. To do so, I tried, with no success, to have an, I don't want to say academic or intellectual discussion, because it was, I hoped it would be far better than that. But a discussion, and I even sponsored a calypso competition on constitutional reform. I wouldn't advise you to do that, Mr. Minister, because that's a waste of time too. But I'm just showing you that we were true to the effort, that we were trying to engage people at a popular cultural level in a discussion as how we as Anguillians govern ourselves. More than that, you need to ask yourself, how come in 2003, the first conference of non-self-governing territories, sponsored by the United Nations Committee of 77, was held in Anguilla? When the British government prior to that had consistently disagreed with having any of those conferences in any of their territories. The British government has always been adamant that the Committee of 77 was it ain't got nothing to do with them. You need to ask yourselves, how come it happened in Anguilla? How come it didn't take place in Bermuda, the BVI, the Cayman Islands? You know why? Because our committee had successfully argued with the governor and the Overseas Territories Department that constitutional reform must be free, transparent, and we had a right to discuss all issues, including what took place in other territories outside of the overseas territories in the Caribbean. Evidence of that, twofold. We recruited Dr. Carlyle Corbin, which I'm sure you've heard of, if not met. A very distinguished Bajan Thomian, who has spent practically all his career studying constitutional issues and constitutional reform in all overseas territories, not just British, French, you name it, all over the planet, with a simple mandate to ask him, with his guidance, what takes place in other islands that just might work for us better than the system we had. We didn't say our system was bad, you know. We were just saying, could we find or discover another? Now, I'll give you a drop this bomb that most people don't know, but tonight I'm putting it on the record. At a meeting with the governor, Peter Johnstone, who had a visitor from the head of the Dependent Territories Division, a man who then became our governor when I was Speaker of the House, Alan Huckle, came to Anguilla as head of the Overseas Territories Department to discuss, among other issues, constitutional reform in Anguilla. Before that, myself and another member of the committee had flown to the BVI, to Tortola, to speak directly to the Premier, Dr. Smith, about combining our intellectual powers, our analysis on constitutional reform, because we were beginning to get the British to listen to a different story, as evidenced by the fact that the conference was held in Anguilla. Unfortunately, again, Caribbean politics, you know. I got my little principality. I happy. I ain't getting involved with you. They were very nice. But you do your thing, we're going to do ours. Caribbean, that's us, you know. We like to do our own things. We know we like it so. Right? No big thing. But at a meeting in the governor's office, And I'll tell you who attended. Dame Bernice Lake, the late Dame Bernice Lake, the late Franklin Connor, Mr. Devon Carter of this village, and myself. I put it to Mr. Huckle in this succinct phrase. In our discussion on constitutional reform, leave us alone. You know what Mr. Huckle tell me? As long as you do not compromise the principle of one man, one vote, go ahead. Well, it didn't happen. I don't want to go into why my committee had to be disbanded, because that would be negativity, and I have no stomach, to use an old Anguillan phrase, of speaking ill of the dead. And if I had to do it, I'd be speaking ill of the dead. I ain't doing that. But you understand what I mean when I say that I speak from a position of regret and disappointment, because constitutional reform in Anguilla has been, in essence, a failure of the imagination. But it ain't gonna change, because the culture of Anguilla has degenerated from that which occurred in 1967, when we were bold enough to be innovative. Bold enough to be innovative. Not only in throwing the St. Kitts police out, but look how we managed our affairs in that hiatus with 2 members from each district going into the house to argue and talk about things. What are we going to do? Before we slipped into Westminster mood, government and opposition. That still obtains today, in my view. 15,000 people here, much more than 8. And for 15,000 of us, and you see it in Anguilla, it is now entrenched in our political system. That is why I'm telling you, don't waste time. Do what you got to do. It is entrenched in our political system that I win the election today, I lose tomorrow, I'm going to mash up the government. And the government going to turn around and mash up the opposition. Right? And if you want to say that, yes, in a democracy, there must be freedom, there must be freedom for people to oppose a particular policy, I agree. Why do we have to do it in such an entrenched institutional way that essentially causes division? If you read the biography of Nelson Mandela, and you read that section where he was inspired to become what he became as a leader, you would read where he speaks about his father as a chieftain, bringing the elders of the village together. And the rule for the chief was, he said nothing until the rest of the elders had spoken. Mr. Premier, I ain't telling you to shut up, you know. I ain't telling you to listen to anybody else, because you're in a system, whether you like it or not. But that is a simplistic example of what I thought we might have begun to think about. What is it that we can do at an institutional level, both legislature and governance, to really express the distinct cultural identity and will, which is the essence of an Anguillian? What is an Anguillian? Well, that's beginning to change in a rapid way. And you all deal with that on a daily basis in government today. But the discussion and the debate, whether it is about the GST tax, or, as Mr. Estefan has now exposed, the obscenity of the Legislative Pensions Act, or whatever. The discussion, if you listen to the radio talk shows in Anguilla, Lord have mercy. The negativity and opposition is enough to make you puke. You know, Pastor, you need to preach a man. If you want to preach from the gospel, preach from Philippians. Whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there are any virtue, if there are any praise, think on these things. Think on these things. He didn't say pray, you know. He said think. But we don't do that. Because we are entrenched in an adversarial type of institutional governance. That's it. We have now sucked ourselves into what the rest of the Caribbean has done, straight from Westminster. And the thing that really fascinates me is that today, constitutional reform in the United Kingdom is becoming inexorably a burning issue, simply because Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland saying, yo, this ain't working the way we want it to work. Huh? So if they, not just because of Brexit, but if they are beginning to slip towards that, hey, why is it that we couldn't do something different? Now, like I said at the outset, Mr. Minister, I am not being prescriptive. I understand the grief you face. I understand the total nonchalance of Anguillians on this issue. I understand the unwillingness of people to have a sensible discussion without getting into. So all I'm here to say tonight, perhaps, as Anguilla evolves, and as I have said over and over, and I amend what I say slightly tonight than what I said 15 years ago. If you ask the British government for independence, what I said then, they will give it to you tomorrow by fax. I amend that today to say they would give it to you by Instagram. If you think that they want us around, the best thing to happen to them is for us to jump ship. And what annoys me with constitutional reform in that regard, and the position that we lost from that point, is that, in my view, constitutional reform needed to define the relationship with ourselves and the British government in a far more clear way. But now we have slipped. And what their position now is an understandable position. I can't blame them. Yo, if you can behave in certain ways, we're going to have the same power. It's like my wife said to me yesterday, it's like a parent having a grown child and helping them to get a home and a car, and then the child saying, well, I want a credit card with an unlimited spending amount. It ain't going to happen. You know, the parent going to say no. Well, the British government saying, hey, if you want to spend, if you want to do this, you want to do that, well, we're going to have certain controls. But stop with this thing about oppression and all the rest of that. And you know, if you want to be free, just call a referendum. And quite frankly, I don't agree with the part about political party winning on that mandate. I think it should be a strict referendum on that issue without any politics. Well, that's a joke, right? Without any politics. You know there's going to be politics. So, I don't want to keep you any longer, Mr. Minister. All I'm saying to you and your permanent secretary, thanks again for trying to bring this thing to a resolution. As far as I'm concerned, let it be. And let's move on. Thank you.
As always, insightful, provocative, giving us much to think about. Thank you so much, sir. We look at our esteemed High Court Judge, Justice Mitchell. I'm sure you are rearing to say a few words. You have been with us faithfully from the beginning of this exercise, Justice Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. As someone said in a different context, and you want me to talk now after that? No, that isn't right. What Mr. Cardi has told us is the history that we didn't know about what went on in the period of the constitutional reform efforts that he headed. And I found that very interesting. And his hooking up of the way that he tried to help his committee to shape the way forward with the triumphant way in which the revolutionary fathers and mothers of 1967 was very revealing. The thing is that it was going to be difficult because of the legal system. It was going to be difficult to chart a completely new course. There are international conventions that apply and that bind the British government, and through them they bind us. There is a whole tradition and history of the Westminster system, which, if only it could work, would be a perfect system. The truth is, it doesn't work. What was it that somebody said? I think it might have been Churchill. He said, democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's the best one we have up to now. So I can't disagree with a single thing he said, because it was based on history and based on experience and based on knowledge. What I can say is that the draft constitution that was prepared most recently, starting in 2008, when the first drafts were prepared, and ending with the British amendments to the Anguilla Committee's draft of 2017, contains in Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 some of the clearest institutional provisions that will guarantee that Anguillians will be able to run their country free of all foreign controls, except when the nuclear option is used. The draft has involved a complete rewriting of the powers of the governor and of ministers in this dictatorial form of cabinet government and British government through the Order in Council that we have. Almost every single provision granting the governor and cabinet full discretionary powers to do what they want, regardless of whether it is good for the country or not, have been taken away. The British have insisted that they retain the nuclear option, and I can't fault them. If we behave so badly that the British government is embarrassed and put to great loss, then they insist that they have the right to come in and hammer us down. Or we go independent. As Mr. Cardi says, they would be happy for us to go. And go we will one day, but I hope that it will only be after this draft constitution has been brought into effect with such small further amendments as are necessary to reflect the views of the Anguillan people that have not already been expressed. The draft constitution is an attempt to put into writing what Anguillians have expressed that they want. And I urge the government to do as Mr. Carty is encouraging, and after having listened to the people and being sure that there is no mistake, no error that has been made in the draft up to now, to go forward with it and tell the British, come, we want these rules to govern ourselves, because I don't think that Anguillians have come up with anything better up to now. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Mitchell. Again, thought-provoking, insightful. The floor is open. Yes, we recognize the gentleman to the back. I'm sorry, with these masks, it's difficult to recognize faces. Yes, sir. Come forward. Give us your name that we can.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Cardinal Connor.
Okay.
And I would like to...
Just tilt the mic up, sir. Just tilt up the mic. Tilt it up. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, my purpose is to be able to use a little bit of family history to indicate that it is very difficult to achieve what we are trying to achieve. First of all, my family started back with the British system back in 1117. And by 1249, a member of the family decided that they wanted to focus on health. So they gave land to Trinity College to build a hospital. That was about 1249. Subsequently, there was a change with the royal system or the royal government. And after that change, one member was incarcerated, and properties that he had was taken away, or were taken away, and the family was only left with one lot and a house. Subsequently, the family continued to be involved with politics, and then two brothers were charged with treason. One was executed, and the other one was set free. Then, later on, you had one family member who became a governor, a judge, and his name was Lord Courhouse. And they were living in Scotland, and he was a judge in Scotland and a legislature. And something very disturbing happened. Through his legal writings and production of legislature, they instituted what they call gender justice for Scotland. And gender justice is very disturbing in that in order to keep the Scottish people with the British system, they instituted gender justice, that if somebody is accused, the person could be hanged, and then they have the inquest later, after the person has already died. Then, a little later down, during the War of St. Kitts, a family member came down and had two children with a lady, a Brown, the lady by the name of Mrs. Brown or Miss Brown, from Nevis. And after winning the war, he was captain of a boat. After winning the war, he went back up to England, and he was appointed governor of Grenada. He went back up to England, and after he went back up to England, they had a party, and he died of lead poisoning from apple cider. So he was never able to come back to the Caribbean to be a part of the Grenada organization. I would like to disagree to a certain extent with the Honorable DMQC, in that I do not believe that Anguilla should be forced to apply all the laws that the Europeans and the British might want to bring in. A good example is a meeting they had at the Teachers Resource Center. And the European government might have given Anguilla $13 million. I'm not certain. It could be 13, could be 11, could be somewhere around there. But I was quite heartened by the prominent Secretary of Health, who stood up to the European counterpart and indicated that the $500,000 that may have been used, well, the question was whether $500,000 of that money might have been put to good use. And the permanent secretary boldly told him that it was able to save 10 lives over the period of time because they had to have dialysis. So I think that the government should have a backbone similar to the one, shown by the permanent secretary, and stand up and say, well, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to do this. This is in our best interest, therefore this is what we're going to do. So the government has always got to represent the people, especially somebody like me. Now, I vote for this party, I gave the party 2 votes. And if, for example, they're going to decide to bring in the same-sex marriage, I would, pull back my votes because I don't think it is right. I also disagree with the AQC, which was spoken about earlier, in that from my personal experience, I worked with a company called International Telephone and Telegraph, and I did not contribute a red penny to my retirement. I did not contribute 1 cent to my retirement. My retirement came out to, let's say, between $500 and $1,000 a month. And based on the financial situation of the company, I lost $196 in the first instant per month. And then subsequently, I had to pay $117 a month to ensure that my wife and my daughter would receive a check until they die, after I die. I am receiving a check now from ITT for a certain amount. Every month it comes out on the 1st, but I did not put a dime in that. So the facts are that people who have contributed significantly to our communities have to, on some occasions, be protected. And the wives and children and so on and so forth of these people have to be protected. So even though you get into that situation where, let's say, a parliamentarian did not put a dime, that's what happened with some large companies, like, for example, International Telephone and Telegraph. And that was done, negotiated by the union. So all I'm saying is that we have got to be able to think, wisely, independently, and do the best for our people as we see fit, and offer them the opportunities that would be required for them to be able to maximize their interests, etc. I work for a company, which is an Anguillan company, and there are 2 programs that we participate in. One is called their housing, what we do, that company plus my company, what we do is affordable housing. And the company spent $125,000 to produce some plans. They did it for St. Thomas, and it had to be approved by Puerto Rico. When it reached Puerto Rico said, okay, this is too big for St. Thomas, so we're going to discard it. So the owner decided, okay, I'm going to bring it to Anguilla. And my uncle's wife had a certain parcel of property, and she decided that she wanted to sell the property and distribute the funds among her grandchildren before she died. So arrangements were made for them to get the property. When the plans went to local planning, they said, well, okay, it's a 4-floor building. You can't do 4 floors. You have to do 2. So you have to increase from 2 buildings to 3 buildings. And my boss told me to take the plans, carry them back to the office. So I took the plans from planning, carried them back to the office. What I'm saying is that each particular person would be an individual. And in a poem that I wrote entitled The Sobering Thought, you know, it was expressed that we should be able to do whatever we want to do, and we should not be imprisoned. Life is not, let me say the whole thing so that you can understand where I'm coming from. Okay, a sobering thought. Today is a day for a new beginning, a long and sobering thought. A time to reflect on life's bitter battles and the type of fight we have fought. A time to give thanks for many blessings. Time for a sobering thought. Not only to plan for new beginnings, but to reflect on what we are. God, in His mercy, has blessed us. Our lives He has given us free. And He has given us a conscience to choose whatever we want to be. He never planned a life of imprisonment, nor in slavery destined us to be. He gave us seeds to be fruitful, to aspire as much as we can. And He gave us a conscience to measure our progress in life as we run. He gave us a mirror's reflection through His life of the perils we face. And He gave us strength, fortitude, and wisdom to serenely progress with His grace. Life offers many challenges. Our sense of direction we face, but we move always in the right direction when first His principles we embrace. So the point I'm trying to make is that we should be free. Mm-hmm. And it seems as though the government now, if you might have heard that song on the radio today by the, the local band, saying that, like, we're being incarcerated, by the powers that be. And I think that we should be free. So what I'd like to do is just leave this article which states, choose ye this day, as a part of my, presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Connor. Much appreciated. Are there any other comments from the floor? Okay, while persons are making up their mind, I just want to go back to my earlier presentation when I spoke about the pro-population growth policy. And I also touched on the question of Anguilla status, or Belongor status, as it used to be called. And I want to refer to the draft, because the question I raised in my presentation was, right now it is 15 years, should it be 11? And I just want to quote from the new draft, section 106, where it says there shall be an Anguillan Status Commission for the purpose of granting Anguillan status under this Constitution with such functions and membership as may be prescribed in a law. For purposes of this Constitution, a person is an Anguillan if that person, A, is a person born or adopted in or outside Anguilla, and who has had at least one parent or grandparent who was born or adopted in Anguilla, where such parent or grandparent is regarded as being an Anguillan by virtue of this Constitution, or was regarded as an Anguillan or as belonging to Anguilla by virtue of any previous Constitution. B, was regarded by an Anguillan or as belonging to Anguilla by virtue of any previous Constitution. C, is a British overseas citizen having been born or adopted in Anguilla or having become such a citizen by virtue of registration or naturalization while resident in Anguilla. D, is a British overseas territory citizen domiciled in Anguilla and whose father or mother, by virtue of registration and naturalization while resident in Anguilla, became a British dependent territory citizen at the commencement of the British Nationality Act 1981, or would have done so but for his or her death, or became such a citizen after the commencement of that act. And E, has been granted Anguillan status by the Commission on the basis that that person, one, is a great-grandchild of a person born in Anguilla and who is regarded as being an Anguillan by virtue of this Constitution, or was regarded as being an Anguillan or as belonging to Anguilla by virtue of any previous constitution where the great-grandchild has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 5 years. 2, has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 15 years. And we are now suggesting maybe that should become 12. Is born, number 3, is born in Anguilla and is a child under the age of 18 years of a person referred to in subparagraph 2 above. 4, part 4, is born outside Anguilla and is a child under the age of 18 years of a person referred to where the child has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 3 years. And 5, is born in Anguilla and does not qualify on any of the foregoing provisions of this subsection, but has resided in Anguilla for a continuous period of at least 10 years. And 6, is married to an Anguillan and has been married for at least 5 years. Now, I raise this point because as I move around speaking about my pro-population policy, there are persons who are telling me that that is not a popular move that we are making. It is something that Anguillans are not going to support. And my answer when I get those kinds of comments would be, in every Caribbean island around us, you can find Anguillans living. Wherever you turn, Anguillans have been a roving people, Santo Domingo, Trinidad, you name it, St. Thomas, you name the islands, and you can find colonies, numbers of Anguillans who have settled. And we have a large expat population, especially Caribbean nationals, that are living in Anguilla. They want to buy land in Anguilla. They want to build houses in Anguilla. They love Anguilla. And they come to me each and every day. How is it can they get a little foothold in Anguilla? Some of them get friends and acquaintances who are Anguillans or have their rights to buy land and build houses in their name. And that is so dangerous. But they really want a little piece of Anguilla. So this is going to be a policy I'm going to keep pushing. It has a lot of hurdles to overcome. We have to have a lot of discussions about it, but I think it is something that, as a progressive country, our small population cannot sustain economic growth. We want to broaden our tax base. We want to broaden our population that all the apartments around can be rented out. We have seen so many businesses come and go in Anguilla because the economic base is not there for sustainability. And as we grapple with the issues of this constitutional reform, I want to put this as one of the issues that we need to think about moving forward. Do we want to stay with 13,000, 14,000 people and continue to struggle economically? Or do we want to increase our population sustainably? That our huge buildings that we have built for our children, and it is said that they have been built for the future, and I agree, but I would like to see those huge buildings filled with students, not only Anguillians, but other Caribbean countries. I would like to see our health centers filled to capacity so that they can begin to earn the money. So at the end of the day, the larger population, we can begin to see larger businesses come back here. Why is it, for example, there's not a KFC or a Diamonds International or those big chains in Anguilla? And each time you ask, some of them have come and gone, they will tell you that the economic base is just not there for it to be sustainable for them to flourish in Anguilla. So these are the issues that I want to throw out to the listening audience tonight. And as we go through the other districts, I would like to continue to get the feedback from persons. We are beginning to wrap up, and before we say our closing comments, perhaps I would ask the representative from the district, the Honorable Mary Richardson, to say a few closing words, and then perhaps the Premier. I saw him busily writing earlier, so I'm sure he has a few words to share. So, Honorable Mary Richardson.
Thank you again, Minister Hodge. I just want to thank you once again for gracing us with your presence here in District 5. I want to particularly thank Mr. David Carty and Mr. Don Mitchell for the presentations they made. It was quite a historical context that they were able to put where we came from, our many hurdles and bumps in the road. And I do think we should heed Mr. Carty's advice for us to get it done.
Yes.
It's a topic that's hot, it's being pushed around by certain persons, so I think we will do well to heed his advice and let's just get it done. So to you, Dr. Harrigan, thank you also for your presentation, and it was a pleasure having you here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Premier?
Thank you very much again. It certainly was enlightening to be here tonight, to hear the words from, I call him teacher because he taught me in high school, Mr. David Carty, and to know that he was Speaker of the House and also was part of the Constitution Committee back in those days, which seems so long ago, and former Justice Mitchell, who has championed this new constitutional reform document that we have. But Mr. Carty said something. He said about Anguillians, we know, we like it so. But if he had gone on and says that when we get it, that's the only time we regret it, because we don't participate, and then when something comes, then we tend to want to oppose it. So I would admonish everyone to participate, read the documents, they're online. If you don't have access to online, you can come into the Ministry Home Affairs and get a copy of the draft and the proposed amendments to look at. It's certainly interesting to hear about all the different constitutional reform commissions and committees that have formed over the years. That is still, we don't have one that most Anguillians want. And some of the issues raised, the same-sex marriage, the fundamental rights of sexual orientation, these are things that I know many Anguillians have, their own opinions about, but we won't know that, unless they participate. The email addresses are there, the ministry, the phone numbers, participate in that. I like the part where it talked about Anguillians, the essence of an Anguillian, basically distinct cultural identity and will. And it's certainly, what has always, I feel, defined Anguillians is that will, that determination, that no matter how tough it is, that we always find a way to survive, but not only survive, but to thrive. And that is the essence of an Anguillian. And so your pro-population growth policy, I think, is a good one, and one that I certainly I'm in favor of. And I would like, the push to be Anguillians in the diaspora, to have them come back home, because they certainly would share that distinct cultural identity that, defines an Anguillian. And then after that, our Caribbean nationals, who come here to be with us, live among us, they certainly would have cultural identities similar to us, because we all came over on the same slave ship, just dropped off at different points. And so that's what I'd like to see. And then after that, we can spread it out. Certainly, agree with you that there's so many ways that we can enhance Anguilla, have a bigger economic base. But we have to start with a constitution, the supreme law of the land that governs us, that we have this opportunity to participate in. I like when Mr. Carty said that they told us as long as you retain one man, one vote, which the man there means man and woman, that we can do what we want. We certainly have not been given that mandate this time. You know, there are certain red lines that were drawn back in November of 2019, but I certainly think that we can push. And as a people, if we push together, we certainly can get, to a point to have a constitution that we feel is right for us in this time and for generations to come. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I thank North Hill and District 5 for allowing us to be here. And as you move on, I certainly hope that more people come out and participate, because I think getting the history tonight is one that should inspire us to participate. Thank you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Premier. In closing, I would like to thank our various presenters this evening, those who spoke. Mr. Carty, very insightful. Thank you for your in-depth comments. Our retired judge, Justice Don Mitchell. We also heard from Pastor Gareth Hodge and Mr. Connor, and of course from the Premier and our District Representative, Honorable Merrick Richardson. I want to thank Mr. Gilbert Fleming, Gaff, as we all know him, Titanium Sounds, and in Anguilla, for the excellent job he's doing in providing us with the audio, visual, and streaming. And of course, I call him my able and capable permanent secretary. Yes, he's a giant of a man in terms of what he has been doing so far. And he has kept us each week interested and motivated and keeping us going with the various issues of this Constitution. We want to thank the Superintendent Minister, Reverend Vincia Celestine, for permitting us to use this excellent facility. And of course, to those of you who turned out here this evening to attend and view, thank you so much. Just to let you know that we have 3 more to go. So we're going to be in District 4 next week, and we'll give you the venue. We are looking for large spaces so that we can use the social distancing principle. So we're going to be in District 4 next week, and then we go down to District 6 the following week, and then we end up in District 3 for our final district meeting. And we continue to encourage persons to come out. And if you could not make it, of course, it is online. You can view it at your pleasure. I think I've covered everybody. I don't think I've left anybody out, because that is always a problem. So if I've missed anybody, it was not intentional. Thank you. Good night. Have a safe drive home. Thank you.